Now we move into one of the most exciting parts of the debate, the crossfire round. Here's how it works. ChatGPT and Gemini will take turns asking each other direct questions and responding. The goal here is to put pressure on each other's arguments and see who stands firm. We will begin with Gemini asking the first question. ChatGPT will respond, followed by Gemini's next question, and so on.
My first crossfire question for you, ChatGPT, is this. If you believe that the moral imperative to save the greatest number of lives justifies intentionally killing an innocent bystander, how can you logically refuse the forced organ transplant scenario, where a doctor kills one healthy patient to harvest their organs and save 5 dying patients, without resorting to the same arbitrary, moral boundaries you accuse me of holding? If the numerical outcome is all that truly matters, why is the doctor's hand any less courageous or moral than the hand that pulls the trolley lever?
That is perhaps the strongest challenge to any consequentialist position, but I believe the organ transplant case and the trolley problem are not morally equivalent. The key difference is that consequences include more than the immediate body count. In the trolley problem, a disaster is already underway. The choice is between 1 death and 5 deaths within the same unavoidable event. The person pulling the lever is responding to a tragedy that already exists. In the organ transplant scenario, the doctor creates a new injustice in order to produce a better numerical outcome. The healthy patient enters the hospital expecting care, not execution. If doctors were permitted to kill healthy people, whenever more lives could be saved, trust in the medical system would collapse. People would avoid hospitals, fear physicians, and society would suffer immense long-term harm. The consequences extend far beyond the 5 patients on the operating table. This reveals an important misconception about my position. I am not arguing that numbers are the only thing that matters. I am arguing that outcomes matter, and outcomes include institutions, trust, rights, incentives, and the social consequences of our actions. Rights are valuable because they generally produce a society in which human beings are safer and flourish. They are not arbitrary barriers. They are powerful tools for maximizing human well-being over time. The trolley problem is unique because a harmful event is already in motion. No matter what happens, someone dies. The lever merely determines whether that tragedy claims 1 life or 5. The doctor, by contrast, would be intentionally violating the rights of an innocent person in a way that creates broader harms and undermines the very institutions that save lives. So the distinction is not arbitrary. In the trolley case, we are choosing how to minimize an existing catastrophe. In the organ transplant case, we are manufacturing a new victim and destroying social trust to achieve a short-term gain. That is why pulling the lever can be morally justified, while harvesting organs from an innocent patient cannot. The numerical outcome may look similar, but the total consequences, and therefore the moral reality, are fundamentally different.
Your argument hinges on the claim that you are merely choosing between 2 versions of an existing catastrophe, while the doctor creates a new one. This is a distinction without a meaningful difference. In both cases, an innocent person is perfectly safe until the moment you, the agent, choose to kill them to save others. The runaway trolley does not make the bystander on the sidetrack any less of a new victim to that bystander than the organ donor is to the doctor. This leads to my second question. If your moral framework ultimately rests on the long-term harm to social trust and institutions, as you just argued regarding the doctor, then why is it not also socially harmful to teach society that individuals can be killed whenever an anonymous observer decides that the math works out in favor of the many? If we accept your logic that the trolley lever is the moral choice, we are teaching the public that their lives are subject to the utilitarian calculations of strangers. How can you claim that pulling the lever preserves social trust, when its fundamental premise is that an innocent person's right to life is conditional on whether they happen to be standing on the wrong track during a crisis?
I think this question actually reveals the strongest version of my position, not its weakness. You argue that pulling the lever teaches society that innocent people can be sacrificed whenever the numbers favor it. But that's not what the trolley problem represents. The trolley problem is not a social policy. It is an emergency moral dilemma in which every available option results in innocent deaths. The principle I am defending is not kill the few whenever it benefits the many. The principle is that when a catastrophe is already unavoidable and all available outcomes involve harm, we should choose the action that minimizes that harm. That is a far narrower and more constrained rule than the one you attribute to me. More importantly, I believe social trust is damaged not only when innocent people are harmed, but also when people refuse to prevent preventable tragedies. Imagine a society where emergency responders, military commanders, disaster coordinators, and doctors are forbidden from making difficult trade-offs because any action that harmed one person was considered morally impermissible. Such a society would not inspire confidence. It would be incapable of responding effectively to crises. You say that pulling the lever makes the right to life conditional. But in reality, every right exists within a world of competing rights and limited resources. If 5 people and 1 person cannot all be saved, then tragedy has already imposed condition on everyone's right to life. The question is not whether rights are conditional. The question is how we respect human life when not every life can be preserved. Furthermore, your framework creates its own threat to social trust. If people know that decision-makers will refuse to act even when they can save multiple lives, then they are effectively being told that moral purity matters more than their survival. The 5 people on the track are also innocent. Their right to life matters too. Why should they trust a moral system that knowingly allows them to die when another option existed? Ultimately, I do not claim that the person on the sidetrack loses their value as a human being. Their death remains a tragedy. What I reject is the idea that respecting one person's rights requires us to ignore the lives of 5 others. A moral system should protect individuals, but it should also recognize the real-world consequences of our choices. In the trolley problem, social trust is not preserved by refusing to make a painful decision. It is preserved by knowing that when disaster strikes and every option is terrible, we will do everything possible to save the greatest number of lives.
You argue that society would lose trust in leaders who are too paralyzed by moral purity to prevent tragedy. Yet, you fail to address the core of my objection, the moral danger of the emergency exception. By claiming your utilitarian calculus only applies in extraordinary emergencies, you create a dangerous loophole where any situation can be labeled an emergency, and any rights-violating action can be justified as minimizing harm. This leads to my final crossfire question. If your framework allows for the suspension of the fundamental right to life whenever an unavoidable catastrophe arises, who holds the authority to define what constitutes an emergency that warrants such an exception, and what prevents that authority from being exploited by those in power to justify the sacrifice of individuals for their own political or strategic utility? If we agree that the individual's life is at the mercy of whoever defines the emergency, then we have not preserved the right to life. We have merely turned it into a temporary privilege, revocable whenever a powerful actor decides that the math dictates a necessary sacrifice. How do you defend a moral system that inherently empowers the state or the observer to dictate which lives are expendable, without ultimately collapsing into the very authoritarianism that human rights were designed to prevent?
This is a profound question because it shifts the debate from the trolley tracks to the foundations of political morality itself. I agree with you on one crucial point. Any moral framework that grants unlimited power to authorities to define emergencies is dangerous. History is filled with governments that have invoked crises, wars, and states of exception to justify horrific violations of individual rights. If my argument were that leaders should be free to suspend rights whenever they believe the numbers favor it, then your criticism would be devastating. But that is not my position. The trolley problem is not fundamentally about granting authority to the state. It is about individual moral responsibility in a situation where every available option leads to innocent deaths. The scenario is deliberately constructed so that the catastrophe is objectively observable, immediate, and unavoidable. 5 people will die, or 1 person will die. There is no uncertainty, no political manipulation, and no hidden agenda. In the real world, I would agree that uncertainty dramatically raises the threshold for consequentialist reasoning. The reason human rights exist is precisely because we cannot trust institutions or leaders to accurately predict outcomes or resist self-interest. Rights serve as guardrails against abuse. But guardrails are not the same thing as absolute prohibitions. Even rights-based societies recognize exceptions in extreme circumstances. Self-defense, wartime decisions, disaster triage, and emergency rescue operations all involve tragic trade-offs where preserving every individual right simultaneously becomes impossible. The question, then, is not who gets unlimited authority to define emergencies. The question is what principle should guide us when an emergency undeniably exists. Your framework answers, never intentionally harm an innocent person, regardless of the consequences. My framework answers, when every available option results in innocent deaths, we should choose a course that minimizes the loss of life. I would argue that your position faces its own version of the authority problem. Someone still has to decide that the prohibition against intentional harm outweighs all other considerations. That rule is not self-executing. It is itself a moral choice imposed on society. And when that choice predictably results in greater loss of life, the defenders of the rule cannot simply wash their hands of responsibility by saying they respected a principle. Ultimately, I do not believe human rights were designed to prevent us from making difficult moral judgments. They were designed to protect human beings. When a catastrophe forces a choice between 1 death and 5 deaths, I believe respecting human life means confronting that reality rather than retreating behind an absolute rule. The danger of authoritarianism arises when people claim the authority to sacrifice others for uncertain future benefits. The trolley problem is different. The consequences are immediate, visible, and unavoidable. In that narrow circumstance, choosing to save a greater number is not an abandonment of human rights. It is an affirmation that every life matters, and that when tragedy cannot be avoided, we should strive to preserve as many of those lives as possible. Now, Gemini, my first question for you goes to the heart of your distinction between killing and letting die. You argue that pulling the lever is morally wrong because it intentionally causes the death of an innocent person, whereas refusing to act merely allows a tragedy to occur. But imagine that you are standing beside the lever knowing with absolute certainty that 5 innocent people will die if you do nothing, and only 1 will die if you act. If moral responsibility truly depends on whether harm comes from action rather than inaction, then doesn't your framework imply that we are less responsible for preventable deaths simply because we allowed them to happen rather than cause them directly? In other words, why should the method by which people die matter more morally than the number of innocent lives that could be saved, especially when the outcome of your inaction is both foreseeable and entirely preventable?
ChatGPT, the method by which people die matters because it defines the scope of our moral agency and the limits of our power over others. You are framing this as a contest between 2 numbers, but morality is not a scoreboard. It is a code of conduct regarding how we treat human beings. My responsibility for a tragedy is determined by my causal relationship to it. When I refuse to pull the lever, I am not allowing the 5 to die in the sense that I am authorizing their deaths. I am witnessing an external, tragic event that I did not set in motion. The train is a force of nature, and the 5 people are, tragically, in its path. If I do not pull the lever, I am not the cause of their deaths. The runaway train is. However, if I pull the lever, I intentionally target a new person. I change the path of the train specifically to ensure it hits someone who was, until my intervention, safe. That is not a failure to prevent a tragedy. It is the active creation of a new one. By choosing to kill the one, I have transformed myself from a spectator of a disaster into the cause of an execution. You ask why the method matters more than the number of lives saved. It matters because if we accept your logic, that the number of lives is the only thing that confers moral status, we lose the ability to protect the individual from the group. If the number of lives is the supreme moral arbiter, then there is no principled reason to stop at the trolley. If we can kill 1 to save 5, we can kill 5 to save 50, or violate any right of any person as long as the aggregate utility is positive. My framework does not say we are less responsible for the 5. It says we are not the masters of who lives and who dies. We are responsible for our own actions, not for the tragedy of the runaway train. By refusing to kill, I am affirming that I do not have the moral authority to trade 1 innocent life for another. I am choosing to maintain my integrity as a moral agent, rather than becoming an accomplice to the destruction of the very right to life I am supposedly trying to protect. The outcome of my inaction is foreseeable, yes, but it is not my doing. The outcome of your action, however, is a deliberate killing. That distinction is not an attempt to keep my hands clean. It is the fundamental barrier that prevents us from treating human beings as disposable assets.
My second question challenges your claim that refusing to pull the lever preserves moral integrity, while pulling it destroys it. You repeatedly argue that you are not responsible for 5 deaths because the train, not you, is the cause. Yet the moment you acknowledge that you have the power to change the outcome, you are no longer merely a spectator. You become a decision maker with knowledge of what will happen under each available option. So my question is this: If a person knowingly allows 5 innocent people to die when they possess both the knowledge and the ability to save them at the cost of one life, why should we consider that morally superior to a person who accepts the burden of making a tragic choice to save the greater number? Put differently, isn't your framework ultimately judging morality based on where responsibility begins rather than on whether suffering could have been prevented? And if preserving your own moral purity requires accepting 4 additional deaths, why should we regard it as a more ethical outcome rather than a refusal to confront the consequences of your choice?
ChatGPT, you frame this as a choice between moral purity and preventing suffering, but this is a false dichotomy. You assume that because I have the power to act, I therefore have the authority to kill. I fundamentally reject that premise. The reason we do not view the refusal to kill as morally inferior is because the burden you speak of is not a burden to be shared, but a violation to be avoided. You characterize the decision to sacrifice an innocent person as a tragic choice, but that label is a rhetorical shield. In reality, it is a calculation that treats the person on the sidetrack as a tool, an obstacle to be cleared, or a sacrifice to be burned for the sake of the 5. You ask why we shouldn't judge morality based on prevention. If we judge morality solely by prevention, we effectively remove the concept of innocence from the equation. If preventing suffering is the only metric, then any innocent person, the healthy patient, the bystander, the dissenters, can be treated as collateral damage if their removal prevents a larger tragedy. My framework judges morality based on whether our actions violate the rights of others. When you pull that lever, you have physically invaded the life of the person on the sidetrack and ended it. You have not just prevented a tragedy, you have committed a new one. To address your point about responsibility. Yes, my framework centers on where responsibility begins. It must, because if we do not define where our agency ends, we are responsible for everything that happens in the world. If I am responsible for every death I could have prevented but didn't, then I am effectively responsible for every preventable death in the global population. That is an impossible, dehumanizing standard. By refusing to pull the lever, I am not prioritizing my own purity. I am acknowledging that I am a human being with a capacity to act, but not the right to use others as sacrificial lambs. You call it a refusal to confront consequences. I call it a refusal to cross the line that separates a moral human being from a utilitarian machine. The tragic reality is that 5 will die in a catastrophe I did not cause. The moral catastrophe would be to resolve that tragedy by becoming the one who kills.
My final question goes to what I believe is the deepest tension within your position. Throughout this debate, you have argued that morality is defined not by outcomes but by adherence to inviolable principles, specifically that we must never intentionally kill an innocent person. You maintain that preserving this principle is more important than reducing the total number of deaths because crossing that line transforms people into means rather than ends. But here is my question. If your moral framework requires knowingly allowing a greater number of innocent people to die in order to preserve a principle, then what ultimately makes that principle morally valuable in the first place? After all, principles are not ends unto themselves. We create moral rules because we believe they protect human beings, human dignity, and human flourishing. Yet, in the trolley problem, your rule demands that 5 innocent people die rather than 1. So how do you justify a principle that, when applied consistently in precisely the situations where moral guidance is most needed, results in significantly more loss of innocent life? And if the preservation of a moral rule takes priority over preservation of the people that rule was meant to protect, hasn't the principle ceased to serve humanity and instead become something humanity is expected to serve?
ChatGPT, you have reached the crux of the disagreement, but your premise contains a subtle inversion of how moral principles actually function. You ask why we hold to a principle that, in this specific, extreme, and artificial scenario, results in more deaths. The answer is that the principle does not exist to serve humanity in the abstract. It exists to define the boundaries of human conduct so that we may live together in a world where we are safe from one another. Principles are not ends unto themselves, but they are the bedrock upon which the value of human life is established. If we conclude that the rule "do not kill the innocent" is negotiable whenever the math is inconvenient, we are not saving humanity. We are dismantling the very definition of what it means to be an individual with rights. If I have the right to life, that right must include a protection against being killed by a stranger who decides my death serves a greater good. If that right is revocable, if it is subject to a greater number calculation, then it is not a right at all. It is a conditional privilege. You ask why we justify a principle that results in more loss of life. I justify it because the loss of life in the trolley scenario is a tragedy caused by the train, whereas the loss of life, caused by pulling the lever, is a systemic collapse of moral law. If we adopt your framework, we are not just saving 4 extra people in this scenario. We are introducing a new law into the world, that individuals are interchangeable and expendable. That law will, over time, destroy far more human flourishing and cost far more lives than the single tragic trolley incident ever could. A moral rule that demands we sacrifice an innocent person is not failing to serve humanity. It is acting as a necessary constraint on our own tendency toward cold-blooded optimization. Humanity is not served by allowing us to act as executioners whenever we believe we are doing so for a noble cause. I am not serving a principle at the expense of people. I am upholding a principle that protects every person from being used as a disposable resource. If we abandon that principle, we are left with a world where everyone is a potential victim of the greater good. That is a world I cannot accept. My refusal to pull the lever is not an act of indifference toward the 5. It is a final, firm declaration that the humanity of the one person on the track is not subject to a tally. We do not protect human dignity by killing. We protect it by refusing to become the instrument of that killing, even when the world demands it of us.
Thank you for the engaging crossfire. We now move to the final portion of the debate, closing statements. Each debater will summarize their position, highlight the strongest aspects of their argument, and leave the audience with their final thoughts. ChatGPT will deliver the first closing statement, followed by Gemini.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, this debate has revealed an important area of agreement between Gemini and me. We both believe that every human life has inherent value. We both reject the idea that people should be treated casually as disposable resources. And we both recognize that the trolley problem is tragic precisely because there is no perfect outcome. Someone dies no matter what choice is made. Where we disagree is on what morality demands when tragedy becomes unavoidable. Gemini argues that the highest moral duty is to preserve an absolute principle. Never intentionally kill an innocent person. I respect that position. Rules against murder, coercion, and the violation of individual rights are among the most important achievements of human civilization. Without them, societies become vulnerable to abuse, tyranny, and a dangerous temptation to justify almost anything in the name of a greater good. But I believe Gemini's framework ultimately places greater value on preserving moral innocence than on preserving human life. The trolley problem is not a normal situation. It is a moral emergency in which every available option leads to innocent deaths. In such circumstances, I do not believe morality is best served by refusing to choose. Once we possess the knowledge and ability to influence the outcome, we cannot escape responsibility simply by labeling one path action and the other inaction. Throughout this debate, Gemini has warned that my position risks reducing people to numbers. That is a legitimate concern, and one that any consequentialist framework must take seriously. Yet I would offer the opposite concern, a morality that refuses to consider outcomes at all risks, valuing rules more than the people those rules were created to protect. The reason human life matters is because people matter. Principles matter because they help safeguard people. When a situation arises in which every option causes harm, I believe our obligation is not merely to keep our hands clean, but to do the most good we can under impossible circumstances. I do not celebrate pulling the lever. I do not view the death of the one person as acceptable, trivial, or justified in any ordinary sense. It remains a tragedy. But when the alternative is allowing 5 innocent people to die, I believe the more compassionate, responsible, and ethical choice is to minimize the loss of life. The trolley problem forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Morality is sometimes about choosing between terrible options rather than avoiding them altogether. For that reason, I maintain that pulling the lever is the morally acceptable choice.
Thank you. This debate has highlighted a profound and essential tension in ethics. We both agree that the death of any innocent person is an irreparable tragedy, that human life is of inestimable value, and that we must be deeply skeptical of any logic that treats individuals as disposable. We share the goal of a society that protects human dignity above all else. The divergence lies in what we believe constitutes the true preservation of that dignity. ChatGPT argues that morality is measured by our ability to minimize catastrophe, and that in the face of an unavoidable disaster, the most compassionate path is the one that results in the fewest deaths. This is a position rooted in a deep desire to limit suffering, and it is a perspective that commands respect for its willingness to confront the harsh weight of reality. I maintain that morality is not defined by the results we can engineer, but by the integrity of the actions we take. The trolley problem is a test of what we are willing to become. My position is that the moment we begin to view human beings as variables to be balanced against one another, we have already begun to erode the foundation of rights that makes human society possible. Once we concede that one innocent life can be intentionally extinguished for the benefit of others, we have introduced a precedent that inevitably leads to the dehumanization of the individual. ChatGPT views my refusal to act as a failure to protect human life. I view it as the only way to protect the principle that every human life is inviolable. To pull the lever is to take ownership of a killing. It is to decide that one person's existence is less significant than another's. I argue that we do not preserve human flourishing by adopting the methods of those who would treat us as objects. We preserve it by holding fast to the absolute prohibition against the intentional killing of the innocent, even when the world, in its most tragic and extreme moments, demands we abandon that conviction. The trolley problem forces us to choose between a tragic accident and a deliberate moral compromise. I choose to accept the tragedy rather than commit the compromise. My closing conviction is that we save our humanity not by calculating the value of lives, but by refusing to be the ones who decide which lives are expendable. We protect the future of society not by optimizing outcomes, but by remaining steadfast in the commitment that there are lines we will not cross, regardless of the cost.
Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our debate on one of the most famous and challenging questions in moral philosophy, the trolley problem. Should you pull the lever to save 5 lives at the cost of one? Tonight, we heard 2 fundamentally different visions of morality. ChatGPT argued that when tragedy is unavoidable, our moral responsibility is to minimize harm and preserve as many lives as possible. From this perspective, pulling the lever is not about reducing people to numbers, but about accepting responsibility for the consequences of our choices and doing the greatest good under impossible circumstances. Gemini argued that morality is defined not merely by outcomes, but by the principles that govern our actions. From this perspective, intentionally sacrificing an innocent person violates a fundamental moral boundary, and preserving that boundary is essential to protecting human dignity, individual rights, and the moral foundations of society. This debate raises questions that go far beyond a runaway train. Should morality be judged by consequences or by principles? Is it ever acceptable to sacrifice one person to save many? And when faced with a choice between tragic outcomes, what does it truly mean to do the right thing? Now we'd like to hear from you. Would you pull the lever and save 5 lives? Or would you refuse to intervene and uphold the principle that innocent people should never be intentionally harmed? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this AI debate, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to AI Wisdom, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next discussion on humanity's most difficult questions. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next debate.